And there's other issues around what I call the Camberwell-Peckham question, if you indulge me. You know, the narrative around entry onto FTSE 100 boards, for example, is very much around we need diversity, of course, but we need to get more women onto those boards. Well, that's fine. But the narrative is that every woman has, in the UK, has less chance of getting onto the board of the FTSE 100 company than every single man. Now, no one can possibly tell me that a black or a white kid on a boy who's in a one-parent family on a council estate in Peckham and Camberwell, who goes to a poor school, has more chance than a privately educated woman who went to Rowley. But that, the narrative, actually says that those black and white boys on a council estate have far more chance of being on the board of the FTSE 100 company. And that cannot be true. Cannot be true. So I've named that the Camberwell-Peckham question because that's the constituency of Howard Harman. Now, in terms of mental health, you know, and Martin will be the expert on this. You know, the government announced a big £1 billion fund for mental health. Of course, it's really welcome. But the narrative again was that didn't mention about maldepression, didn't mention about suicide. There was various bits of the funding which were compartmentalised, including 290 million on maternity, which of course is welcome money. I'm sure there should be far more going into mental health in that particular area. But there was no acknowledgement in the speech or the policy or anything about the shocking rate of male suicide. Again, you know, what is it that's preventing government and policy makers and politicians from even just acknowledging this and speaking about it? You know, what is the problem? We'll come back to that equation. Domestic abuse, sexual violence, forced marriage, again, mentioned. Ending violence against women and girls strategy, 80 million. Martin was on the BBC last week, quizzing the minister about that, and he said that within that strategy, councils can apply for money to support men and boys who are victims of domestic abuse, sexual violence, sexual abuse, and forced marriage. But if you read the document, it doesn't mention heterosexual men once. Oh, it's 90 pages. There's about 90 action items. It doesn't mention men and boys once. And in terms of heterosexual men, it only gives the odd mention to go there. You know, why would you think strategy called that was for men and boys as well? Why would you think that? And then just on the pensions debate, these are kind of side issues, but what I've noticed in the pensions debate is that there's been rightly a lot of concern about the effects of equalisation of the pensions on women, especially from kind of mid-40s onwards. And, you know, rightly that debate's to be had. But I've just noticed interesting that the equalisation of pension age in 2018 men have been retiring. Men have been retiring for the last 80 years at a further date out than women. But in the debate around pensions, no one has actually described that clear discrimination. I mean, you've got men who've been retiring 5 years later than women, and no one's actually ever said, in terms of public policy, that that's wrong. That's never been part of the discussion on that. Right, okay, conscious of time. Now, this is why, and this is kind of some of the reasons I'm looking at now. Now, the first one is really the politicisation of gender, and I think gender issues in the UK, I think it's gone through three phases. The first one I would say was about classical equality, which was about equality of opportunity. We had a number of laws, good laws in the 1970s about pay, for example, and also the Sex Discrimination Act and a number of other acts and initiatives which were really important to make sure clearly was a level playing field for everyone in the UK, and it always still sort of bugs me that a woman can get a mortgage unless a man, either a male friend or a husband or her father signed a mortgage application. I think that was up until the early 70s, which obviously beggars belief. And so that was the first phase, and really where I'm getting to there is that especially during the 80s when Margaret Thatcher was in power, you really had equality issues really went underground, and what you started to see was that those issues were kind of debated, discussed, and also become quite militant, especially through trade unions and the Labour Party. And there's something called the grand narrative, which I'll come on to. That was kind of established during those times. And also around gender awareness. There was very much gender awareness that started to develop for women and girls. But men and boys issues, there was just like no gender awareness at all. That any man or boy anywhere in the UK suffered some form of disadvantage. And we get to the second phase, which is around contemporary equality, which really meant that equality of opportunity became equality of outcome, which is a different concept. But with the Blair government, they quickly adopted the kind of gender narrative. They also introduced, so the Minister for Women, they also set up things like Government Equalities Office, Equalities Commission, and of course equalities of outcomes is very much a socialist ideal. You know, whether right or wrong, but it very much fits into the socialist narrative. And what also happened was that those people who'd been underground, and there isn't a conspiracy, I don't think they were all there together, but all of those who were starting to become educated and qualified in the 1980s under Margaret Thatcher, then started to actually assume positions of power in the state, either as politicians, they're either as civil servants, either in leads on all of their academic and professional bodies. And this is when what I call the gender narrative starts to be established. And also you started to get an element of what I would call gender blindness for men and boys. Again, sorry Martin, it was a phrase that Martin's used a lot. Whereas the more and more research was coming out that showed men and boys were suffering disadvantage in certain areas, but the issue was that nothing was actually then being done about that. And then I'll move on to the last one, is Contemporary Equality 101. 101 is obviously based on George Orwell. You've got more than equal equalities, and that should be land, which is probably tell I say I should be saying that. But that's more than equal outcomes. And what you were starting to see was that those the spending started to increase in terms of gender. You saw Gordon Brown as more of a radical prime minister in this type of area, and those that had actually started to actually fit the grand narrative actually were wielding real power, and you see lots of that power being exercised today. A number of us signed a letter at the weekend asking for the Chief Medical Officer to actually produce an annual report on men and boys' health, because last year she produced one on women's health, which is fine. The Men's Health Forum wrote to her to say, well, you did one on women and girls, it's great last year, can we have one on men and boys this year? And she said no, and won't give a commitment actually on that. So a number of us wrote a letter asking her not only to give that commitment, but actually explain why she won't give that. Why she set that pattern, why would she continue it? Okay, grand narrative. Really, this is where I think the narrative now in terms of gender politics and gender issues is that basically what it's saying is that every single woman and girl, every single man and boy, women and girls have problems, they have no free will, there's no positive opportunities or outcomes, there's no control on society, politics and economy, and they're unable to succeed because men are stopping them. That's the narrative. Now, if you look at the narrative around the kind of boardroom issue of gender pay gap, the narrative or the tone of it is very much there's a load of men in every company sitting around the boardroom doing all they can to stop women becoming members of the board or succeeding. That's what the narrative, if you look at the tone, all the reports and the discussions, that is what they're trying to say. And the narrative on men and boys is that men have no problems, they are problems, they have all the positive opportunities, all the positive outcomes, complete control of the economy, politics and society, and they're actively preventing equality for women and girls. And that's the narrative. And when you get to, if you look at some of these issues with regard to men and boys, so on the left-hand side you've got, you mentioned brand narrative, and I just picked out some issues that affect men and boys. So you've got particular issues around sexual violence and the barriers that gay men face in life. Then you've got health, education, rough sleeping, suicide, domestic abuse, contact orders in the family court. And what I've said is that issues around gay men and sexual violence kind of just touch the brand narrative. And the reason they do is because it's men committing crimes against other men, generally speaking. Then you've got health in the middle. That's further out, but that's basically based on innate men's issues like prostate cancer, etc. That doesn't fit any narrative in that respect. They're just innate things about men. Then you've got education, rough sleeping, suicide. They're further out of this narrative because basically they're men's fault. You know, it's a man's fault if he commits suicide or rough sleeper or isn't doing well at school. And the last one, and there's probably more, is domestic abuse and contact orders, where the person, generally speaking, would be a woman committing crime or an issue for men, and that really does not fit any narrative whatsoever. I mean, that is a real outlier. You know, in charities like one I chair, for example, some of the issues that we have is that in society and in public policy, people just don't get it. People just don't get how a woman commit domestic abuse on a man. It's such an outlier. It's so outside this narrative. Okay, a couple of other issues. Political correctness. Anyone who challenges the grand narrative, met with intolerance. I was kind of hoping I might be triggered tonight, but unfortunately not so far. Also, anti-freedom of speech. There's obviously a lot of activity in terms of men and boys actually raising issues, and a lot of women who actually try and raise these issues suffer this as well, and can be career threatening. And I've seen some MPs over the years raise their head above the parapet, get shot down and never say anything ever again. And about 4 years ago, one MP, the Justice Minister now, Dominic Raab, said that there was a lot of problems with feminism, and that's the only time I'll use that word tonight. He had then all the Labour Party, all the Tory Party, and he's Tory Minister now, really shut him down and just saying he was wrong. He's never raised it once ever again. Gavin Barwell is another government minister. He sponsored a big report about boys and reading. He said that there was a couple of issues, the F word and various other things about the way education wasn't boy friendly. Again, he raised his head above the parapet, said that the whole world of pain, and he's never mentioned it again. And also we've got issues around Sir Tim Hunn and others more kind of recently on these types of issues. If you raise your head above the parapet on this, you'll get it knocked off. You'll get it knocked off because of this. Chivalry, I mean, it's part of, and this isn't anything wrong with this, but part of men's DNA is to be, a provider and security for themselves, their family, their friends and community, and society in general. And that's very much part of a man's DNA. So they will always put the concerns of women and girls first. But what that does mean is that issues again about men and boys don't get talked about. And Philip Davis actually said this in Parliament when he was challenged about International Men's Day and why we should have a debate. And he was challenged by Jess Phillips, who's a Labour MP, saying, well, of course, why do you need International Men's Day? Look how many men are actually in Parliament. And he made the point that, men in power, you might have more men in Parliament, and they talk about issues, but they don't talk about men's issues. And I thought it was quite a powerful quote, actually. In terms of the charity sector, I think that there isn't enough men in the charity sector, and welcomely, a lot of the organisations that actually support men and boys are actually run by women or have been founded by women. And I've mentioned my own charity is all run by women, which is great. And also around fundraising preferences, what you tend to find is that men will raise money for women's causes, but women will raise money for men and women's causes. So a lot of people who do fundraising events for men and actually women. And what I'm saying is that men don't tend to raise funds for men's issues and men's charities. And it comes down to this, should we? So I'm not saying that's wrong, I'm just saying that's an issue. And around again, kind of funding. Funding is so limited in the men's and boys charity sector that there's hardly any left for advocacy or research. A very key point of charities in terms of supporting the beneficiaries is actually not only setting up services, but also being acting as a public voice for them. Funding is so limited. Most of the people doing that type of activity have to do it in their spare time. A good example, again, Women's Aid are advertising for a press officer about 35,000, which with on costs will be around 45,000 to the National Insurance State. All fine, but that would run a helpline when I'm involved in for a whole year. And therefore, there's no one in organisations like mine and others doing this kind of public policy work because we're too busy trying to get funding to keep the charity going. That isn't a problem for other charities. There is obviously fear of funding if you criticise a government, even if you're not government funded. And also academic support of men and boys issues is growing, but it's still limited. And I think that a number of the academics here today will vouch for it's harder to get funding if you want to study an issue around men and boys than it is if you want to study an issue around women and girls. So what can be done? I'm very conscious of time. Okay. Number of things that can be done about this. The first one is set up services. And I speak to a lot of groups where people say, well, there's no funding in Wales for domestic abuse refuges or mental health charities. My challenge is, well, have you actually set up a service? It's very easy to say, well, the government's not funding this, but people have to set up services for the government and other companies and others to actually fund. There's some research that said the government in Wales spent 95% of its funding on gender issues for services for women and girls. And I said to the people, well, how many services are there for men and boys in Wales? And they said, well, not many. I said, well, the government, if they've got a pot of money, they've got to give it to someone. If you haven't set up any services, who are they going to give the money to? So that's the key thing. For me, about setting up groups, challenging the government and others in a very mature fashion. And if you just throw rocks at the government and policy makers, they won't actually listen. So you've got to set the right tone and the right narrative, and be very inclusive. And you see a lot of what I've said today is very much have some good legislation around the Equality Act 2010, freedom of information requests, and also some local research. And I'm still looking, and there have been cases where men have used the Equality Act to actually force companies or other organisations to change what they're doing because they're in breach of that act. I can talk to people later about that. In terms of a few other things, you will get opposition if you're trying to put men and boys issues on the political agenda. I think a number of ways to do that is to challenge the silence with facts. It's really important to get your story straight and get the facts, because when you get the facts, then your arguments become harder to rebut and deflect. And I think often there's too much argument about X, Y, and Z issue without any facts actually backing them up. And I think that's really important, because it then puts the pressure on people who are trying to rebut and trying to continue to silence men and boys issues. It puts the pressure on them. Number one is the Linden concept, which I kind of come up with a few years ago. It's based on Neil Linden's book, No More Sex Law. Again, look at some of the issues that come up, and then just switch the genders and say, if this was a man or a boy, would your policy response